In the highest reaches of Skyrim, where the world itself seems to touch the very heavens, there stands a mountain that holds within its ancient stones the most dangerous secret in all of Tamriel. A secret so profound, so morally complex, that it challenges everything we believe about good and evil, redemption and damnation. This is the story of Paarthurnax, the dragon who taught mortals the voice, the ancient wyrm who betrayed his own blood, and the being whose very existence poses a question that has haunted scholars for centuries. But what if everything you think you know about this legendary dragon is built upon a beautiful, terrible lie? High upon the throat of the world, where morning mist dances between weathered stones older than human memory, the first rays of dawn painted the snow-covered peaks in hues of gold and rose. The ancient monastery stood silent in the thin mountain air, its humble structures dwarfed by the immensity of the peak that pierced the sky like a titan's spear thrust toward the realm of the gods. Here, in this place where mortals dare not tread without invitation, where the very air thrums with the power of the voice, an ancient presence waited with the patience of mountains themselves. In the valley far below, in a tower that overlooked the rolling hills of Whiterun Hold, a scholar named Paarthurnax sat surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of ages. His study was a sanctuary of knowledge, filled with tomes bound in leather that had felt the touch of centuries, scrolls whose parchment bore the faded ink of civilizations long fallen to dust. Candlelight flickered across pages written in languages that predated the coming of men to Skyrim, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own across the stone walls, lined with shelves that groaned under the weight of ancient wisdom. Paarthurnax was not like other scholars who sought simple answers to satisfy their curiosity. He was a seeker of deeper truths, a man who found beauty in the paradoxes that revealed the complex nature of existence itself. Born in the quiet village of Riverwood, where ancient pines whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen, he had always been drawn to questions that made others uncomfortable. While his contemporaries built their reputations on clear, definitive conclusions, Paarthurnax discovered that the most profound truths often dwelled in the spaces between certainty and doubt. On this particular morning, as frost painted intricate patterns on his window and the distant mountains stood silhouetted against the brightening sky, Paarthurnax had been contemplating a question that had haunted him for months. The question of Paarthurnax, the dragon who had once served as Alduin's most trusted lieutenant during the darkest days of the Dragon War, who had commanded other wyrms in the subjugation of mankind, who had watched with ancient eyes as mortals were crushed beneath the dominion of dragonkind. Yet this same being had turned against his own kind, had taught the throne to mortal heroes, had spent millennia in meditation upon the highest peak in Skyrim, teaching the way of the voice to generations of greybeards. The Blades called him irredeemable, a monster whose past crimes could never be forgiven, whose dragon nature made true change impossible. The Greybeards spoke of him with reverence, calling him master, crediting him with wisdom that had guided their order for thousands of years. But Paarthurnax had begun to suspect that both perspectives, while sincere, missed something fundamental about the nature of dragons themselves, something that would reshape how mortals understood the very concepts of guilt, redemption, and the possibility of change. As he turned the pages of an ancient Atmaran text, its words flowing across the parchment like a river of faded gold, Paarthurnax felt the familiar stirring of discovery that came when seemingly unrelated pieces of knowledge began to form a pattern. The dragon language itself held clues, he realized, in the way it treated concepts that mortals took for granted. The word for choice, for instance, existed in multiple forms depending on whether the chooser was mortal or dragon, suggesting that the very nature of decision-making operated differently for these ancient beings. But there was something else in these texts, something that made Paarthurnax's pulse quicken with the thrill of approaching revelation. References to the great deception, to truths hidden in plain sight, to the beautiful lie that protected mortals from a reality too complex for their minds to fully grasp. The dragon Paarthurnax, these ancient sources suggested, had never actually deceived anyone about his nature. He had been transparent from the beginning about what he was, what he had done, and what he continued to struggle against every day of his immortal existence. The real deception, Theron began to understand, lay not in anything Paarthurnax had done or failed to reveal, but in mortal assumptions about what redemption meant, about whether beings could truly change their fundamental nature, about the very possibility of judging creatures whose existence operated according to laws that transcended human understanding of right and wrong. The beautiful, terrible truth was beginning to emerge like dawn breaking over mountain peaks, and Theron realized that his quest for understanding was about to take him into philosophical territory more dangerous than any dragon's lair. Outside his window, the morning sun climbed higher into the sky, casting long shadows across the ancient land of Skyrim. Somewhere in the distance, on the highest peak visible from his tower, an ancient dragon waited in patient meditation, carrying within himself secrets that would challenge everything mortals believed about the nature of good and evil. And in his study, surrounded by the whispered wisdom of ages, Theron prepared to begin a journey of understanding that would lead him to question not just the nature of dragons, but the very foundations of mortal morality itself. The story of the deceptive truth about Paarthurnax was about to unfold, and with it, revelations that would forever change how the wise understood the delicate balance between dominance and restraint, between ancient nature and conscious choice, between the beautiful complexity of truth and the comfortable simplicity of judgment. To understand the truth about Paarthurnax, one must first comprehend what it truly means to be a dragon, for these ancient beings exist according to laws of nature that operate far beyond the simple moral categories that govern mortal understanding. Dragons are not creatures who chose evil as mortals might choose to lie or steal or murder. They are something far more fundamental, far more primal, and far more beautiful in their terrible complexity than human minds typically grasp. In the ancient texts that Theron studied by flickering candlelight, dragons were described not as monsters who had fallen from grace, but as living embodiments of dominance itself. They were forces of nature given consciousness, as inevitable in their drive for supremacy as the tides pull toward the moon, as natural as fire's hunger to consume or water's tendency to flow downhill. To understand dragons, the ancient scholars wrote, one must think of them not as beings who decided to dominate others, but as creatures for whom dominance was as fundamental to their existence as breathing was to mortals. The Thuum itself revealed this truth to those wise enough to interpret its deeper meanings. When dragons spoke, reality itself bent to accommodate their will. This was not magic in the way mortals understood it, but rather the most pure expression of what dragons fundamentally were. Their voices carried the weight of absolute authority. Their words of power shaped the world around them because dominance over reality was woven into the very fabric of their being. A dragon's shout could topple mountains, not because they had learned some mystical technique, but because commanding the world to obey was as natural to them as song was to birds or running was to deer. The ancient Atmoran texts spoke of dragons in language that revealed profound understanding of their nature. They described them as creatures of eternal will, beings whose very existence was an expression of the fundamental forces that shaped creation itself. Dragons did not choose to be dominant any more than mountains chose to be tall or rivers chose to flow toward the sea. It was simply what they were, what they had always been, what they would always be for as long as they drew breath and their hearts beat with the rhythm of eternity. This understanding cast the dragon war in an entirely different light than most mortal historians presented it. From a dragon's perspective, the subjugation of early mankind was not an act of conscious cruelty, but the natural expression of their fundamental nature meeting a world filled with beings who existed to be dominated. It was like asking why fire burned wood, or why storms brought rain. The relationship between dragon and mortal was as natural and inevitable as that between predator and prey, between mountain and valley, between the eternal and the temporal. Yet within this seemingly harsh truth lay mysteries that had puzzled scholars for millennia. How could beings of such absolute will, such fundamental dominance, ever choose to change their behavior? How could creatures whose very nature was to rule over others instead turn to teaching, to guidance, to what mortals called wisdom and restraint? The ancient texts hinted at answers that challenged conventional understanding of what change and growth meant for immortal beings. The key Theron was beginning to understand lay in recognizing that dragons did not abandon their nature when they transformed, but rather found new ways to express their eternal essence. Like a river encountering an obstruction and finding a new course around it, dragons could redirect their fundamental drives without ceasing to be what they were. The dominance remained, but its expression could evolve, could become more subtle, more sophisticated, more aligned with purposes that transcended simple conquest. Paarthurnax himself had spoken of this in the few recorded conversations mortals had been privileged to share with him. He described his struggle not as a battle to become something other than what he was, but as an effort to find expressions for his draconic nature that served purposes greater than mere self-gratification. The same will that had once been used to dominate mortals could be turned inward, used to dominate his own impulses, his own desires, his own fundamental drives toward conquest and supremacy. The ancient dragons, according to texts written in their own language and translated by scholars who had spent lifetimes learning to think in draconic concepts, understood existence in terms that were fundamentally different from mortal thinking. Where humans saw linear time, dragons perceived eternal cycles. Where mortals experienced choice as a series of discrete decisions, dragons felt the flow of inevitable consequence guided by will that operated according to deeper patterns than conscious thought. This difference in perception explained why dragons found mortal concepts of justice and redemption so foreign to their understanding. From a dragon's perspective, asking whether their past actions were good or evil was like asking whether gravity was moral or immoral, whether the sunrise was just or unjust. These categories simply did not apply to forces of nature, to beings whose existence was so fundamental to the structure of reality that judging them required stepping outside the normal frameworks that governed moral thinking. But perhaps the most profound insight hidden in these ancient texts was the recognition that dragons were not static beings, despite their eternal nature. Like mountains that slowly shifted over geological time, like rivers that gradually carved new channels through ancient stone, dragons could evolve, could grow, could find new expressions for their unchanging essence. The process was not the rapid transformation that mortals might experience, but rather a gradual refinement that took place over centuries and millennia of patient self-examination. This understanding suggested that the question of Paarthurnax's redemption was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what redemption meant for beings like dragons. Mortals thought in terms of abandoning old ways and adopting new ones, of rejecting past behavior and choosing different paths. But for dragons, growth meant something more subtle, more complex, more beautiful in its sophisticated harmony between eternal nature and evolving expression. The true deception, Theron realized as dawn light streamed through his study window, was not anything that Paarthurnax had hidden from mortals, but rather the assumptions that mortals brought to their understanding of dragon nature itself. The beautiful lie was the comfortable belief that redemption required abandoning one's fundamental essence, when the deeper truth suggested that wisdom lay in finding ever more refined ways to honor what one truly was, while serving purposes that transcended selfish desire. In the time before time, when the world was younger and the boundaries between mortal and divine were as thin as morning mist, dragons existed within a social order so ancient and absolute that it predated the very concepts of rebellion or independence that mortals took for granted. To understand the complexity of Paarthurnax's eventual transformation, one must first comprehend the sacred bonds that held dragon society together, bonds stronger than adamant, more enduring than the mountains themselves, and more fundamental to draconic existence than the very air they breathed. The hierarchy of dragons was not a political structure in any sense that mortals might recognize, but rather a cosmic order that reflected the deepest truths of creation itself. At its apex stood Alduin, the World Eater, firstborn of Akatosh, whose very existence embodied the principle of ending and renewal that governed all of time. Alduin was not merely the strongest dragon or the most cunning, but rather the living expression of temporal dominance, the being through whom the concept of ultimate authority found its most perfect manifestation in the physical world. Below him, yet bound to him by ties that transcended mortal understanding of loyalty or obligation, stood his brother dragons, each occupying their place in the great hierarchy, according to principles that reflected their individual natures and the roles they were destined to play in the cosmic order. These were not positions assigned by Alduin's whim or won through conquest, but rather natural expressions of each dragon's fundamental essence, as inevitable and unquestionable as the fact that fire rose while water flowed downward. Paarthurnax held a position of particular significance in this ancient order, not merely as one of Alduin's lieutenants, but as his brother in the truest sense, bound to the World Eater by connections that had been forged in the earliest days of creation. The ancient texts spoke of their relationship in terms that suggested a bond deeper than mere familial affection or political alliance. They were complementary aspects of draconic nature itself, with Alduin embodying the principle of cosmic dominance, and Paarthurnax representing the wisdom and cunning that guided such power toward its proper ends. In those ancient days, when dragons ruled the world with the casual absoluteness of natural forces, questioning one's place in the hierarchy was as foreign to draconic thinking as questioning the need to breathe would be to mortals. The concept of rebellion, of choosing to act against one's designated role in the cosmic order, simply did not exist within the framework of dragon understanding. They were creatures of perfect will, operating within perfect order, each fulfilling their cosmic function with the same inevitability that drove stars to shine and seasons to change. This absolute nature of dragon hierarchy explained why Paarthurnax's eventual betrayal of Alduin was so unprecedented, so fundamentally shocking to the draconic understanding of existence. It was not merely a political rebellion or a military coup, but rather a violation of the very principles that governed reality itself. When Paarthurnax turned against his elder brother, he was not simply choosing a different side in a conflict, but rather shattering the cosmic order that had defined dragon existence since the beginning of time. The ancient dragon language itself reflected this hierarchical understanding in ways that revealed profound truths about how these beings perceived existence. The words for obedience and loyalty were not separate concepts as they were in mortal tongues, but rather different aspects of a single principle that encompassed both willing service and natural order. To serve one's elder brother was not a choice made from external obligation, but rather the spontaneous expression of one's true nature finding its proper place in the cosmic hierarchy. Elder-brother relationships among dragons carried weight and meaning that mortals could barely comprehend. These bonds were forged not through shared experience or emotional affection, but through cosmic principles that operated at the deepest levels of reality. When Alduin spoke, Paarthurnax listened not because he feared punishment or sought reward, but because the very structure of existence demanded such attention. When the World Eater commanded, his brother dragons obeyed with the same natural inevitability that caused rivers to flow toward the sea. The loyalty that bound Paarthurnax to Alduin during the early ages of dragon dominance was therefore not a political allegiance that could be switched or abandoned based on changing circumstances, but rather a fundamental aspect of how reality itself was organized. To betray such bonds was to commit an act of cosmic rebellion that challenged not merely personal relationships, but the very foundations upon which existence was built. Yet within this seemingly rigid structure lay subtleties that would prove crucial to understanding Paarthurnax's eventual transformation. The hierarchy was not static but dynamic, not mechanical but organic, allowing for growth and evolution within its eternal framework. Dragons could develop, could refine their understanding, could discover new aspects of their nature without abandoning their fundamental place in the cosmic order. The system was designed to accommodate the gradual refinement of wisdom over the vast spans of draconic lifetimes. The ancient texts spoke of councils among the dragon lords, gatherings where the great worms would discuss matters of cosmic significance in voices that made mountains tremble and skies darken with the weight of their deliberations. These were not democratic assemblies where equals debated policy, but rather cosmic communions where different aspects of draconic nature worked together to understand and implement the will of the great hierarchy. Paarthurnax had been a voice of particular importance in such gatherings, valued not merely for his strength or his loyalty, but for his unique perspective on the subtleties of dominance and control. The relationship between Alduin and Paarthurnax during those ancient times was marked by a complementarity that made each more than he could have been alone. Where Alduin embodied the raw power of temporal dominance, Paarthurnax provided the wisdom and cunning that channeled such power toward its most effective applications. Where the World Eater was the storm that swept across the landscape of time, his brother was the intelligence that guided the storm's path and determined where its force would be most perfectly applied. This deep interdependence made Paarthurnax's eventual betrayal all the more profound and mysterious. It was not merely the rebellion of a subordinate against a superior, but rather the severing of a cosmic partnership that had helped define the very nature of draconic existence. The ancient hierarchy that had governed dragon society for millennia was not simply challenged but fundamentally altered, creating ripples that would continue to influence the relationship between dragons and mortals for thousands of years to come. Understanding this ancient context was crucial to grasping the true significance of what Paarthurnax would eventually become. His transformation was not simply a personal journey of moral growth, but rather a cosmic event that redefined the very possibilities of draconic existence, opening pathways for change and development that had never before existed in the eternal hierarchy that governed the lives of dragons. The Dragon War did not begin with battles or declarations, but rather emerged as naturally as winter follows autumn, an inevitable consequence of two fundamentally different types of existence trying to occupy the same world. The ancient chronicles speak of those dark days when Dragoncride ruled over early humanity, not as a period of conquest and rebellion, but as an epoch when the natural order of dominance and submission played out across the landscape of Tamriel with the terrible beauty of a cosmic symphony written in fire and blood. In those primordial times, when the Atmorans first crossed the frozen seas to reach the shores of what would one day be called Skyrim, they encountered a world already shaped by draconic will. The dragons had not conquered the land in any military sense that mortals might understand, but rather had claimed it through the simple expedient of existing within it. Their presence transformed the very nature of the landscape, making it a realm where dominance flowed as naturally as water flowing downhill, where the ancient hierarchy that governed dragon society extended outward to encompass all lesser forms of life. Paarthurnax in those days was not yet the contemplative teacher that later generations would know, but rather the perfect expression of draconic nature operating within its proper sphere. He moved through the early conflicts of the Dragon War with the casual efficiency of a force of nature, directing the lesser dragons under his command with the same natural authority that guided mountain streams toward the sea. His role was not that of a cruel tyrant delighting in mortal suffering, but rather that of a cosmic principle ensuring that the proper order of dominance and submission was maintained throughout the realm. The Atmoran dragon cults that arose during this period revealed the complex relationship between dragon and mortal in ways that challenged simple narratives of oppression and resistance. These were not merely systems of fearful worship imposed by draconic force, but rather sophisticated religious frameworks that recognized the cosmic significance of dragon dominance and sought to find proper places for mortals within the greater hierarchy. The cult priests understood that serving dragons was not degradation, but rather participation in a cosmic order that transcended mortal concerns about freedom or dignity. Within these cult structures, mortals found roles that allowed them to participate in draconic power while maintaining their essential humanity. They became translators of dragon will into forms that other mortals could understand and accept, bridges between the eternal nature of dragonkind and the temporal concerns of human existence. The most accomplished among them learned fragments of the Tuum itself, though always understanding that such power was borrowed rather than owned, granted by draconic grace rather than earned through mortal effort. Paarthurnax's participation in this system was both natural and comprehensive. He commanded not through fear or intimidation, but through the simple fact that his will was stronger, more focused, more aligned with the fundamental forces that governed reality than any mortal could hope to match. When he spoke, the very air seemed to thicken with authority, and mortals found themselves compelled not by external force, but by recognition of their proper place in the cosmic hierarchy. The systematic nature of dragon rule during this period reflected not cruelty, but rather efficiency, the same kind of natural organization that governed the flow of rivers or the movement of seasons. Dragons did not need to actively suppress mortal populations, because the very presence of draconic will created conditions where resistance was as unlikely as water flowing uphill. The hierarchy was self-maintaining, self-reinforcing, as stable and enduring as the mountains themselves. Yet even in those days of perfect draconic dominance, there were mortals who possessed something that challenged the natural order, something that would eventually prove crucial to the transformation of both human and dragon civilization. These were individuals who carried within themselves sparks of what would later be recognized as heroic will, mortals whose spirits burned with an intensity that approached, though it could never equal, the absolute nature of draconic dominance. These exceptional individuals did not rebel against dragon rule in any conventional sense, for they understood as well as anyone the cosmic inevitability of draconic supremacy. Instead, they began to develop philosophies and practices that sought to find ways for mortals to honor their proper place in the hierarchy, while still maintaining something essentially human. They created the first schools of what would later become Nordic warrior culture, traditions that emphasized not victory over dragons, which they knew to be impossible, but rather the cultivation of human excellence within the context of draconic dominance. The suffering that mortals experienced during the Dragon War was real and profound, but it was not the deliberate cruelty of sadistic oppressors. Rather, it was the inevitable consequence of beings whose very nature was temporal and finite, trying to exist within a system designed for creatures who were eternal and absolute. Dragons did not torture mortals for pleasure, but the simple fact of their existence created conditions where mortal flourishing was as difficult as flowers blooming in the depths of winter. Paarthurnax himself was not immune to witnessing this suffering, though in those days he interpreted it very differently than he would in later ages. He saw mortal pain as a natural consequence of the cosmic order, no more troubling than the fact that autumn leaves must fall or that winter storms must blow. The hierarchy demanded certain relationships between dragon and mortal, and if those relationships caused suffering, it was simply part of the natural order that governed all existence. The seeds of rebellion that would eventually lead to open war were planted not by mortal ambition or draconic cruelty, but by the gradual recognition among some exceptional humans that the natural order might not be as fixed and absolute as it appeared. These visionaries began to suspect that mortals possessed qualities that, while different from draconic power, might represent their own form of cosmic significance. They developed the first crude philosophies of human dignity and worth, ideas that would eventually challenge the fundamental assumptions upon which dragon rule was based. As these ideas spread through hidden networks of mortal communities, They created the intellectual and spiritual foundation for what would become open resistance to draconic dominance. The Dragon War was approaching its most violent phase, and with it would come revelations that would transform both mortal and dragon understanding of what was possible in the relationship between the eternal and the temporal, between dominance and submission, between the cosmic hierarchy and the revolutionary possibility of change. But in those early days, as Paarthurnax moved through his duties with the perfect efficiency of natural law, none could have predicted the profound transformation that awaited both dragonkind and mortality. The stage was being set for revelations that would challenge everything both species believed about the nature of existence itself. In the countless centuries that dragons had ruled over the world with the absolute certainty of natural forces, the concept of doubt had been as foreign to their existence as the notion of choosing not to breathe would be to mortals. Yet within the mind of Paarthurnax, as he carried out his duties as Alduin's most trusted lieutenant, something unprecedented began to stir. It was not rebellion in any sense that mortals might understand, for dragons did not rebel against their nature any more than rivers rebelled against flowing downhill. Instead, it was something far more subtle and infinitely more dangerous to the established order, the birth of philosophical questioning in a mind designed for absolute certainty. The first stirrings of this transformation came not through dramatic revelation or sudden enlightenment, but through the gradual accumulation of observations that challenged assumptions Paarthurnax had never before thought to examine. As he moved through the world enforcing draconic will, as he witnessed the interactions between dragon and mortal across the vast expanse of his territory, he began to notice patterns that suggested realities more complex than the simple hierarchy that had always governed his understanding. He observed mortals who faced death with a dignity that seemed to transcend their temporal nature, humans who chose sacrifice over submission, not from ignorance of their place in the cosmic order, but from some inner conviction that operated according to principles he did not fully comprehend. These were not acts of rebellion against draconic authority, but rather expressions of something within mortal nature that existed independently of the hierarchy, something that remained undiminished even in the face of absolute dominance. The ancient texts describe this period in Paarthurnax's existence as the time of growing silence, when the great dragon began to speak less in the councils of his kind, and to spend longer periods in solitary contemplation. His fellow dragons noticed the change, but interpreted it according to their own understanding of draconic nature. They assumed he was deepening his wisdom, refining his perspective, becoming more perfectly attuned to his role within the eternal hierarchy. None suspected that he was beginning to question the very foundations upon which that hierarchy was built. The questions that began to form in Paarthurnax's mind were not the crude doubts that might trouble mortal philosophers, but rather inquiries that operated at the deepest levels of cosmic understanding. He found himself wondering whether dominance, even perfect dominance, was truly the highest expression of draconic nature, or whether it might be merely one aspect of something greater and more complex. He began to contemplate the relationship between power and wisdom, between control and understanding, between the eternal nature of dragons and the finite but mysteriously resilient nature of mortals. These philosophical inquiries led him to examine his own actions and motivations with an intensity that was unprecedented in draconic history. For the first time, a dragon was turning the absolute focus that defined their nature inward, using the same will that had always been directed toward external dominance to explore the depths of his own consciousness. This introspection revealed complexities within draconic nature that had never before been acknowledged or explored. He began to recognize that his loyalty to Alduin, while genuine and profound, was not simply the natural expression of cosmic order that he had always assumed it to be. There were aspects of his brother's vision that seemed to limit rather than enhance the potential for draconic excellence, elements of the World Eater's philosophy that reduced the magnificent complexity of existence to crude exercises in domination and consumption. The realization came gradually, like dawn breaking over mountain peaks, but its implications were revolutionary. The ancient chronicles speak of nights when Paarthurnax would soar above the sleeping world, his great wings carrying him over landscapes where mortals dreamed their brief dreams while dragons maintained their eternal vigilance. During these solitary flights, he began to perceive the beauty inherent in finite existence, the poignant intensity that temporality brought to every mortal experience. Where once he had seen only weakness and insignificance, he began to recognize a form of strength that operated according to principles entirely different from draconic power. This growing appreciation for mortal nature did not diminish his understanding of draconic superiority, but rather expanded his conception of what superiority might mean. He began to suspect that true dominance might not consist in crushing all opposition, but rather in understanding and incorporating the valuable aspects of apparent weakness. The highest expression of draconic will might not be the elimination of all other forms of existence, but rather the wise guidance and protection of lesser beings who possessed qualities that complemented rather than competed with dragon nature. These insights created within Paarthurnax a form of internal tension that was entirely new to draconic experience. He remained absolutely loyal to Alduin in all practical matters, continuing to serve as his brother's lieutenant with the same efficiency and dedication that had always characterized his service. Yet within his mind, he was developing perspectives that seemed to point toward possibilities that Alduin's vision could not accommodate. The philosophical revolution taking place within Paarthurnax's consciousness was aided by his encounters with exceptional mortals who demonstrated forms of wisdom that transcended their temporal limitations. These individuals, often leaders of the dragon cults or particularly gifted priests, showed him that mortal understanding could achieve depths and subtleties that pure draconic logic sometimes missed. They revealed to him the beauty inherent in perspectives that were informed by the knowledge of mortality, the unique insights that could only emerge from minds that understood both the preciousness and the brevity of existence. As these realizations accumulated over the centuries, Paarthurnax began to experience something that no dragon had ever felt before: genuine uncertainty about the rightness of the established order. This was not the confusion of ignorance or the hesitation of weakness, but rather the profound questioning that comes from wisdom, deep enough to recognize the limitations of previous understanding. He began to suspect that the cosmic hierarchy that governed dragon society, while natural and in many ways beneficial, might not represent the ultimate truth about existence that he had always assumed it to be. The internal conflict that resulted from these insights was unlike anything in draconic experience. Dragons were creatures of absolute will and perfect certainty, beings who acted from positions of unshakable conviction about their place in the cosmic order. Yet Paarthurnax found himself caught between his fundamental nature as a dragon and his growing understanding that this nature might need to find new forms of expression if it were to achieve its highest potential. This period of philosophical development was necessarily slow and careful, for the implications of his doubts were so profound that they threatened to undermine everything he had ever understood about existence itself. He could not simply abandon his draconic nature or reject the bonds that tied him to Alduin and the established hierarchy. Instead, he had to find ways to honor his essential nature while exploring possibilities that seemed to point beyond the traditional boundaries of draconic existence. The transformation taking place within Paarthurnax during this period was not a rejection of what he was, but rather an expansion of what he might become. He was not ceasing to be a dragon, but rather discovering aspects of draconic potential that had never before been explored. The doubt that had begun to grow within his mind was not weakness, but wisdom, not confusion, but the beginning of a clarity so profound that it would eventually reshape the relationship between dragons and mortals throughout Tamriel. As this period of philosophical development reached its climax, Paarthurnax stood on the threshold of revelations that would challenge not only his own understanding of existence, but the very foundations upon which draconic civilization was built. The stage was being set for transformations that would prove that even the most fundamental aspects of cosmic order were not as fixed and absolute as they appeared. The transformation of Paarthurnax from unquestioning servant of the draconic hierarchy to the contemplative teacher who would eventually betray his own kind did not occur through his efforts alone, but was catalyzed by an intervention from the divine realm that would forever alter his understanding of existence itself. This was the moment when Kine, the Nordic goddess of the wind and sky, bestowed upon him the most precious and dangerous gift that any immortal being could receive, the ability to perceive existence through mortal eyes. The ancient texts describe this divine intervention not as a dramatic theophany involving blazing light and thunderous voices, but rather as a subtle shift in consciousness that occurred during one of Paarthurnax's solitary meditations high above the world as he soared through the night sky, contemplating the questions that had begun to trouble his perfect draconic certainty. He became aware of a presence that seemed to emanate from the very air around him, a consciousness vast enough to encompass his own, yet gentle enough not to overwhelm his already strained understanding. Kine's gift was not magical in any sense that mortals or even dragons typically understood magic, but rather represented a fundamental alteration in the way Paarthurnax processed reality itself. Suddenly, the eternal perspective that defined draconic consciousness was supplemented by an awareness of how existence appeared to beings whose lives were measured in decades rather than millennia, whose every moment carried the weight of potential finality, whose choices were made not from positions of absolute certainty, but from the courageous acceptance of uncertainty. The immediate impact of this expanded awareness was overwhelming in its intensity and complexity. For the first time in his existence, Paarthurnax experienced the poignant beauty that mortals found in temporary things, the desperate intensity with which finite beings approached their brief opportunities for meaning and connection. He understood suddenly why mortals could display such remarkable courage in the face of draconic power, not from ignorance of their limitations, but from a profound appreciation of what those limitations made possible. Through mortal eyes, he saw that the very temporality he had always dismissed as weakness was actually a source of strength that dragons, in their eternal nature, could never fully possess. Mortals lived with an urgency and intensity that gave weight and meaning to every choice they made, every relationship they formed, every moment of beauty they encountered. Their awareness of death did not diminish their existence, but rather concentrated it, like sunlight focused through a lens until it burned with transformative fire. This new perspective revealed aspects of draconic dominance that had been invisible to his eternal viewpoint. He began to understand that the absolute nature of dragon rule, while natural and in many ways inevitable, created conditions that prevented both dragons and mortals from achieving their highest potential. Dragons, secure in their eternal dominance, had no incentive to grow or change or discover new aspects of their nature. Mortals, crushed beneath the weight of draconic will, were denied the opportunity to develop the unique forms of wisdom and strength that their temporal nature made possible. The gift of mortal perspective also allowed Paarthurnax to recognize the profound loneliness that characterized draconic existence. Dragons were naturally solitary beings, each so absolute in their individual nature that true communion with others of their kind was rare and difficult. They related to each other primarily through the formal structures of hierarchy, rather than through the deep emotional connections that gave meaning and richness to mortal relationships. For the first time, Paarthurnax understood what dragons had sacrificed in exchange for their eternal dominance. As he integrated this expanded awareness into his understanding of existence, Paarthurnax began to perceive possibilities for the relationship between dragon and mortal that transcended the simple hierarchy that had always governed their interactions. He envisioned forms of cooperation and mutual enrichment that could allow both species to achieve heights of excellence that neither could reach alone. Dragons could provide the stability and wisdom that came from eternal perspective, while mortals could offer the innovation and intensity that emerged from their finite but precious existence. This vision revealed to him that true dominance might not consist in the simple exercise of power over others, but rather in the creation of conditions that allowed all forms of life to flourish according to their essential nature. The highest expression of draconic will might be not the crushing of mortal potential, but rather its cultivation and guidance toward forms of excellence that complemented and enhanced draconic achievement. The philosophical implications of these realizations were staggering in their scope and revolutionary in their potential impact. Paarthurnax began to understand that the cosmic hierarchy that governed dragon society, while natural and in many ways beneficial, was not the ultimate truth about existence that he had always assumed it to be. There were forms of order and relationship that transcended simple dominance and submission, possibilities for cooperation and mutual enrichment that the traditional hierarchy could not accommodate. Yet even as these insights transformed his understanding of existence, Paarthurnax remained fundamentally a dragon, bound by ties of loyalty and affection to Alduin, and committed to the essential principles that defined draconic nature. The challenge he faced was not to abandon his dragon identity, but rather to find ways to express his draconic nature that honored both his eternal essence and his expanding understanding of what that essence might become. The process of integrating mortal perspective with draconic nature created within Paarthurnax a form of philosophical tension that was entirely unprecedented in the history of his species. He was caught between two ways of understanding existence that seemed in many ways incompatible, yet both of which revealed important truths that could not be dismissed or ignored. The resolution of this tension would require forms of creativity and wisdom that had never before been necessary in draconic existence. Kain's gift had given Paarthurnax the tools necessary to envision a future in which dragons and mortals could coexist in relationships that enhanced rather than diminished both species. But it had also burdened him with the responsibility of finding ways to make such visions reality. The path ahead would require him to challenge not only the established order of draconic society, but also his own deepest assumptions about what it meant to be a dragon in a world filled with other forms of conscious life. As this period of philosophical transformation reached its culmination, Paarthurnax stood at a crossroads that would determine not only his own fate, but the future relationship between dragons and mortals throughout Tamriel. The gift of perspective had shown him possibilities beyond anything previously imagined, but realizing those possibilities would require choices that no dragon had ever been called upon to make. The decision that would forever alter the course of history did not emerge from Paarthurnax's mind as a sudden revelation or desperate gambit, but rather crystallized slowly over countless nights of solitary contemplation, like frost forming delicate patterns on ancient stone. Armed with the gift of mortal perspective that Kain had bestowed upon him, and tormented by the growing certainty that the established order of draconic dominance was preventing both species from achieving their true potential, Paarthurnax faced a choice that no dragon in the history of creation had ever been called upon to make. The ancient chronicles describe this period as the time of the Great Silence, when Paarthurnax withdrew from the councils of dragonkind and spent long months in meditation upon the highest peaks of what would one day be called the throat of the world. His fellow dragons interpreted his absence as a deepening of wisdom, a natural progression toward greater understanding of his role within the eternal hierarchy. None suspected that he was wrestling with questions that challenged the very foundations upon which their civilization was built. The choice before him was not simply whether to teach the Thu'um to mortals, though that decision would prove momentous enough to reshape the balance of power throughout Tamriel. The deeper question was whether he could find a way to express his fundamental draconic nature through acts of guidance and cultivation rather than domination and control. Could the absolute will that defined dragon existence find fulfillment in empowering others rather than subjugating them? Could dominance itself be transformed into something that enhanced rather than diminished the potential of those subject to its influence? These were not merely philosophical abstractions, but practical challenges that demanded solutions rooted in the deepest understanding of what it meant to be a dragon. Paarthurnax knew that he could not simply abandon his draconic nature, for such abandonment would mean ceasing to exist in any meaningful sense. Instead, he had to discover new ways to honor and express his essential nature while serving purposes that transcended the narrow goals of individual aggrandizement that had always motivated dragon behavior. The breakthrough came through his observation of mortal teachers and wise leaders within the dragon cult communities. He watched as exceptional humans took knowledge and wisdom that had been granted to them by draconic authority and transformed it into forms that other mortals could understand and utilize. These teachers did not diminish their own status by sharing their knowledge, but rather enhanced it, creating networks of understanding and capability that multiplied their individual influence far beyond what they could have achieved through direct action alone. This revelation suggested to Paarthurnax that teaching might represent the ultimate expression of draconic dominance, a form of influence so profound and lasting that it transcended the crude exercise of physical power. A dragon who could shape the minds and spirits of mortals, who could plant seeds of wisdom that would grow and flourish across generations, would achieve a form of dominion more complete and satisfying than any conquest could provide. The teacher dominated not through fear or force, but through the willing submission of students who recognized the value of what was being offered to them. Yet the decision to teach the Thu'um specifically to mortals carried implications that extended far beyond personal philosophical satisfaction. The voice was not merely a tool or technique that could be shared like mortal knowledge, but rather a direct expression of draconic nature itself. To teach mortals the Thu'um would be to grant them access to the fundamental force that made dragons supreme among all forms of life. It would be to bridge the gap between mortal and dragon in ways that could fundamentally alter the relationship between the species. Paarthurnax understood that this decision would be seen by his fellow dragons not as enlightened wisdom, but as the most profound form of betrayal imaginable. He would be sharing the sacred essence of draconic power with beings who were supposed to exist only to serve dragon will. From the perspective of traditional dragon society, this would be equivalent to a mountain teaching the valleys how to rise above it, or fire instructing water in the art of burning. The moral weight of this decision was compounded by his awareness that teaching mortals the Thu'um would inevitably lead to conflict with Alduin and the established draconic order. He was not simply choosing to pursue a personal path of philosophical development, but rather setting in motion events that would challenge the fundamental structure of the world as it had existed for millennia. The knowledge that his choice would bring suffering and conflict to both dragons and mortals weighed heavily upon his consciousness. Yet Paarthurnax had come to understand that this conflict was not only inevitable but necessary. The current order, while stable and in many ways natural, was preventing both species from achieving their highest potential. Dragons, secure in their eternal dominance, had become stagnant and complacent, content to rule over a world that offered them no challenges or opportunities for growth. Mortals, crushed beneath the weight of draconic authority, were denied the chance to develop the unique forms of wisdom and strength that their temporal nature made possible. The decision to teach was thus not merely an act of rebellion against established authority, but rather a creative attempt to find new forms of order that could accommodate the needs and potentials of both species. Paarthurnax envisioned a world in which dragons and mortals could coexist in relationships of mutual enrichment, where the eternal wisdom of dragonkind could guide and enhance mortal achievement, while mortal innovation and intensity could challenge dragons to discover new aspects of their own nature. The practical implementation of this vision required careful consideration of how draconic power could be transmitted to mortal consciousness without destroying the essential humanity of those who received it. The Thuum was not simply a collection of powerful sounds, but rather a direct expression of will made manifest in reality. For mortals to learn the voice, they would need to develop forms of mental discipline and spiritual strength that approached, though they could never equal, the absolute nature of draconic consciousness. This realization led Paarthurnax to develop what would later be known as the Way of the Voice, a philosophy and practice that transformed the Thuum from a crude expression of dominating will into a sophisticated tool for spiritual development and ethical action. Rather than simply teaching mortals to shout with draconic power, he would guide them toward understanding the deeper principles that made such power meaningful and beneficial rather than destructive. The Way of the Voice represented a revolutionary reconceptualization of what the Thuum could be and do. Instead of using the voice to dominate and control, practitioners would learn to use it as a means of achieving mastery over themselves, developing the kind of internal discipline and clarity that would allow them to wield power responsibly. They would learn to see the Thuum not as a weapon for conquering others, but as a tool for conquering their own limitations and achieving their highest potential as conscious beings. This transformation of the Thuum, from an instrument of dominance into a path of spiritual development, reflected Paarthurnax's own journey from unquestioning servant of the draconic hierarchy to contemplative seeker of wisdom that transcended traditional categories, just as he had learned to redirect his fundamental drive toward dominance into forms that enhanced rather than diminished other forms of life. So too would mortal practitioners of the Way of the Voice learn to transform their will to power into will to wisdom. The decision to teach was thus simultaneously an act of the most profound generosity and the most revolutionary rebellion. Paarthurnax was offering mortals the greatest gift that any dragon could bestow, while simultaneously challenging every assumption upon which draconic civilization was built. He was creating possibilities for cooperation and mutual enrichment between species, while setting in motion conflicts that would reshape the world. As he prepared to take the first steps toward implementing this momentous decision, the ancient hierarchy that had governed his existence for millennia would be shattered by his choice, and with it would come consequences that even his expanded wisdom could not fully predict. Yet he also knew that this choice represented the only path toward a future in which both dragons and mortals could achieve the fullness of their potential. The moment of final decision approached like dawn breaking over mountain peaks, inevitable and transformative, carrying within it the promise of new possibilities and the certainty of profound change. The word betrayal carries within it connotations of treachery and dishonor that seem inadequate to describe the cosmic significance of what occurred when Paarthurnax finally turned against his elder brother Alduin. This was not the simple violation of trust that mortals might understand, nor even the political rebellion that dragons might recognize, but rather a fundamental rupture in the very fabric of reality itself, a shattering of bonds so ancient and absolute that their breaking sent shockwaves through the foundations of existence. The moment of decision came not in the heat of battle or the passion of argument, but during one of those quiet councils where the great dragons gathered to discuss matters of cosmic significance. Alduin had summoned his brothers to consider how best to respond to the growing audacity of mortal resistance, how to crush the sparks of independence that seemed to be spreading through human populations despite the seemingly perfect efficiency of draconic dominance. The World Eater spoke with his usual terrible certainty about the need to demonstrate absolute power, to remind mortals of their proper place through displays of overwhelming force. As Paarthurnax listened to his brother's words, he felt the weight of all the insights that had accumulated over centuries of philosophical development, all the wisdom that Kind's gift had made possible, all the understanding that had grown from his observation of mortal courage and dignity in the face of seemingly hopeless circumstances. The path that Alduin proposed led only toward greater suffering and the ultimate stagnation of both species, while the alternative that Paarthurnax had begun to envision offered possibilities for growth and mutual enrichment that transcended anything the current order could provide. The ancient chronicles describe the moment when Paarthurnax first spoke against his brother's will as a tremor that shook the very foundations of the mountain where they held their council. This was not merely the sound of one voice disagreeing with another, but rather the cosmic disruption that occurred when a fundamental principle of existence was challenged for the first time in the history of creation. The other dragons present fell silent in shock, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. Paarthurnax's words were chosen with infinite care, for he understood that what he was about to say would transform him from loyal brother into cosmic rebel, from servant of the established order into architect of revolutionary change. He spoke not with anger or defiance, but with the gentle certainty of one who had achieved a clarity of vision that transcended personal desire or ambition. He explained to Alduin that the current path of absolute dominance was leading both dragons and mortals toward a future of diminished potential, that true greatness lay not in crushing all opposition, but in finding ways to enhance and guide the development of all forms of conscious life. The response from Alduin was immediate and terrible in its intensity. The World Eater's rage was not merely personal anger at being contradicted, but rather the cosmic fury of a principle of existence that found itself challenged at its very core. For Alduin to accept Paarthurnax's perspective would have meant abandoning everything he understood about his own nature and purpose, would have required him to reconceptualize his entire existence in ways that his eternal mind could not accommodate. The philosophical debate that followed was conducted not in words but in the deeper language of draconic will, a communion of absolute intentions that made the very air around them shimmer with barely contained power. Each dragon present understood that they were witnessing a conflict that would determine not merely the future of their species, but the fundamental principles according to which existence itself would be organized. The stakes could not have been higher. The implications could not have been more profound. As the debate intensified, it became clear that no resolution was possible through discussion or persuasion. Alduin and Paarthurnax had developed visions of reality that were fundamentally incompatible, and neither could abandon his perspective without ceasing to exist in any meaningful sense. The conflict had moved beyond the realm of philosophy into the domain of cosmic necessity, where only the direct test of will against will could determine which vision would prevail. The battle that erupted between the two brothers was unlike any conflict in the history of dragonkind. This was not a simple contest of strength or skill, but rather a confrontation between two different understandings of what existence itself meant and how conscious beings should relate to one another. Every clash of claw and fang carried within it the weight of cosmic principle. Every exchange of tomb resonated with the fundamental forces that shaped reality. The turning point came when Paarthurnax, drawing upon the mortal perspective that Kain had granted him, employed a concept that was entirely foreign to traditional draconic thinking. He used against Alduin the very understanding of mortality that had transformed his own consciousness, wielding the concept of finite existence like a weapon that could wound even the eternal nature of dragonkind. This was the moment when the Dragonren shout was first conceived, when the idea of imposing mortal limitations upon immortal beings first took shape in the cosmos. The effect upon Alduin was devastating in ways that transcended physical damage. For the first time in his existence, the World Eater was forced to confront the reality of limitation, to experience the constraints and uncertainties that defined mortal existence. The dragon who had always embodied the principle of eternal dominance found himself suddenly vulnerable to concepts of ending and change that challenged everything he understood about his own nature. In that moment of cosmic vulnerability, Paarthurnax struck with all the power that his centuries of philosophical development had made possible. Yet this was not a blow struck in anger or hatred, but rather an act of profound compassion, an attempt to free both his brother and the world from the limitations imposed by an understanding of existence that had become too narrow to accommodate the full potential of conscious life. The result was not the destruction of Alduin, which would have been both impossible and contrary to Paarthurnax's vision of transformed relationship, but rather his banishment through time itself. The World Eater was cast forward into a future where the cosmic order he represented would no longer hold absolute sway, where the possibilities that Paarthurnax had envisioned might have the opportunity to develop and flourish. As the echoes of battle faded, and the cosmic disruption began to settle into new patterns of order, Paarthurnax found himself transformed not merely from loyal servant into rebel leader, but from dragon into something entirely new in the history of creation. He had become a bridge between species, a being who embodied both the eternal wisdom of dragonkind and the temporal insights of mortal existence, a teacher whose very nature challenged every assumption about the relationships that were possible between different forms of conscious life. The victory was complete, but its cost was profound in ways that would take centuries for Paarthurnax to fully understand. He had gained the freedom to pursue his vision of transformed relationship between dragon and mortal, but he had lost forever the simple certainties that had once defined his existence. The path ahead would require forms of wisdom and courage that no being in the history of creation had ever been called upon to develop. As the other dragons fled in confusion and terror, and as the first mortal heroes began to approach the site of this cosmic battle, Paarthurnax stood alone on the mountain peak that would become his eternal home, contemplating the magnitude of what had been accomplished, and the even greater magnitude of what remained to be done. In the aftermath of the cosmic battle that had shattered the ancient hierarchy of dragonkind, Paarthurnax found himself in a position that no dragon in the history of creation had ever occupied. He was no longer bound by the absolute certainties that had once defined draconic existence, yet neither had he abandoned his fundamental nature as a being of eternal will and absolute power. Instead, he had become something entirely new, a dragon who must create his own understanding of what it meant to exist as a creature of dominance, in a world where that dominance had been voluntarily transformed into something resembling service. The mountain peak that became his permanent residence was more than a physical location. It was a symbolic representation of the philosophical heights he had achieved and the spiritual isolation that such achievement necessarily entailed. From this vantage point, high above the world where mortals live their brief but intense lives, Paarthurnax began the long process of developing a new understanding of draconic existence, one that could accommodate both his eternal nature and his revolutionary insights about the potential for cooperation between species. The first centuries of this self-imposed exile were perhaps the most difficult period in Paarthurnax's long existence. The philosophical frameworks that had previously given structure and meaning to his life had been shattered by his rebellion against Alduin, yet the new understanding he sought to develop had not yet crystallized into forms that could provide the same sense of purpose and direction. He was caught between two worlds, no longer able to find satisfaction in the simple exercise of dominance that had once defined draconic fulfillment, yet not yet capable of fully realizing the vision of transformed relationship that had motivated his rebellion. During these early years of solitude, Paarthurnax developed what would later become known as the philosophical practice of eternal vigilance. This was not simply a matter of watching for external threats or maintaining awareness of political developments in the world below, but rather a complex discipline of continuous self-examination that required him to monitor and evaluate every impulse, every desire, every manifestation of his fundamental draconic nature to ensure that it served purposes consistent with his expanded understanding of wisdom and responsibility. The challenge was immense, for dragons were not creatures designed for such internal struggle. Their nature was to act from positions of absolute certainty, to express their will without hesitation or doubt, to dominate their environment with the same natural inevitability that drove fire to burn or water to flow downhill. Yet Paarthurnax had committed himself to a path that required him to question every impulse, to evaluate every action according to criteria that transcended simple self-interest, to find ways to honor his draconic essence while serving purposes that enhanced rather than diminished other forms of life. The development of what would become the philosophical foundation of the Way of the Voice emerged from this struggle with his own nature. Paarthurnax began to understand that the highest expression of draconic dominance might not be the conquest of external opponents, but rather the conquest of internal limitations and destructive impulses. The dragon who could master himself, who could redirect his fundamental drive toward dominance into forms that served the greater good, achieved a victory more complete and satisfying than any external conquest could provide. This insight led to the creation of meditation practices that were entirely unprecedented in draconic history. These were not the simple contemplations that dragons had always engaged in as they considered matters of cosmic significance, but rather sophisticated techniques for achieving conscious control over the deepest aspects of draconic nature. Through these practices, Paarthurnax learned to experience his drive toward dominance not as an external force that controlled his actions, but as a tool that could be consciously directed toward purposes of his own choosing. The arrival of the first mortal pilgrim seeking wisdom from the dragon who had betrayed his own kind marked a new phase in Paarthurnax's development. These early seekers were not the refined philosophers who would later establish the Greybeard tradition, but rather crude warriors and desperate survivors who had heard rumors of a dragon who might be willing to share the secrets of power with mortals. Their initial interactions with Paarthurnax were tentative and often misguided, for neither species had any precedent for the kind of relationship they were attempting to establish. Yet these early encounters proved invaluable for Paarthurnax's own development, for they forced him to translate his philosophical insights into forms that mortal minds could comprehend and utilize. The process of teaching required him to examine his own understanding with unprecedented clarity, to identify the essential principles that underlay his transformed perspective, and to find ways to communicate these principles that honored both the complexity of the ideas and the limitations of mortal comprehension. The gradual development of the teaching relationship between Paarthurnax and his mortal students created a form of mutual enrichment that neither species had previously imagined possible. The mortals gained access to forms of wisdom and power that had always been the exclusive province of dragonkind, while Paarthurnax discovered that the process of teaching enhanced his own understanding in ways that solitary contemplation could never achieve. Through the questions and insights of his students, he was challenged to explore aspects of his philosophy that he might never have examined on his own. As generations of mortal students came and went, leaving behind traditions and teachings that would eventually coalesce into the formal structure of the Greybeard Order, Paarthurnax observed the patterns of growth and development that characterized mortal learning. Unlike dragons, who achieved understanding through the application of eternal will and absolute focus, mortals learned through processes of gradual development that allowed for error correction and refinement over time. This observation led him to develop pedagogical approaches that honored the unique characteristics of mortal consciousness, while still transmitting the essential insights that would allow humans to benefit from draconic wisdom. The internal struggle that defined this period of Paarthurnax's existence was not a conflict that could be resolved through victory or defeat, but rather an ongoing process that required constant attention and refinement. Each day brought new challenges to his commitment to transformed existence, new temptations to revert to the simple certainties of traditional draconic behavior, new opportunities to test his understanding against the complexities of actual experience. The discipline required to maintain his philosophical commitments while honoring his essential nature demanded forms of courage and persistence that no dragon had ever been called upon to develop. The loneliness of this existence was profound in ways that mortals could hardly comprehend. Paarthurnax had voluntarily severed himself from the community of dragonkind without gaining full acceptance into the community of mortals. He existed in a space between species, connected to both yet fully belonging to neither. The weight of this isolation was compounded by his awareness that his choices had set in motion changes that would continue to unfold for millennia, creating consequences that he could influence but never fully control. Yet within this loneliness, Paarthurnax discovered forms of satisfaction and meaning that were unavailable to dragons who remained within the traditional hierarchy. The relationships he developed with successive generations of mortal students, while necessarily limited by the brevity of human life, possessed an intensity and poignancy that enriched his existence in ways that the formal bonds of draconic society could never match. Through teaching, he experienced the joy of witnessing growth and development in others, the satisfaction of seeing his insights take root and flourish in minds that would carry them forward into futures he could never fully imagine. The wisdom that emerged from these centuries of solitude and internal struggle was not simply a refined version of traditional draconic philosophy, but rather something entirely new in the history of conscious existence. It was an understanding that bridged the gap between eternal and temporal perspectives, that honored both the absolute nature of draconic will and the precious uncertainty of mortal choice, that found ways to express dominance through service and power through restraint. As this long period of development reached its culmination, Paarthurnax had become something that had never before existed in creation. A dragon whose nature had been consciously transformed through philosophical discipline and ethical commitment, yet who remained fundamentally draconic in all the essential aspects of his being. He had achieved the synthesis between eternal wisdom and temporal insight that his rebellion against Alduin had made possible, creating a living example of the potential for conscious beings to transcend the limitations of their original nature while still honoring its essential characteristics. The stage was now set for the final testing of this transformed understanding, as new challenges would emerge that would require all the wisdom and strength that centuries of solitude and self-examination had made possible. In the ancient fortress of Skyhaven Temple, carved into living rock and hidden among the mountain peaks of the Reach, there existed an order whose very identity was forged in the crucible of dragon fire and human determination. The Blades had been born from humanity's most desperate hour, when mortal heroes first took up arms against the seemingly invincible might of dragonkind, and their institutional memory carried within it truths about dragon nature that no amount of philosophical speculation could alter or diminish. To understand the Blades' unwavering stance regarding Paarthurnax, one must first comprehend the depth of knowledge they possessed about the true nature of dragons, knowledge purchased with the blood of countless heroes across millennia of conflict. This was not the theoretical understanding of scholars who studied dragons from the safety of libraries, nor the reverent acceptance of mystics who encountered them in contexts of teaching and guidance, but rather the hard-won wisdom of warriors who had faced dragons in mortal combat and survived to pass their insights on to future generations. Delphine, the last keeper of this ancient wisdom, embodied in her person the accumulated experience of an order that had dedicated itself entirely to the proposition that dragons were existential threats to mortal civilization that could never be trusted, reformed, or safely tolerated. Her perspective was not shaped by hatred or prejudice, but rather by a form of institutional knowledge so deep and comprehensive that it transcended individual opinion and approached the level of natural law. When she spoke of dragon nature, she spoke not as one person expressing her views, but as the voice of history itself testifying to truths that had been proven through centuries of bitter experience. The Blades understood, as few others did, that dragons were not simply large, powerful creatures who happened to be dangerous, but rather beings whose very existence was antithetical to the flourishing of mortal civilization. Dragon nature was not a set of behavioral tendencies that could be modified through education or moral development, but rather a fundamental orientation toward existence that made them incompatible with any world in which mortals hoped to achieve their full potential. This understanding was not theoretical but empirical, based on observation of dragon behavior across thousands of years and countless different circumstances. From the Blade's perspective, the admiration that some mortals felt for Paarthurnax's apparent transformation represented a dangerous form of wishful thinking that ignored the most basic realities of dragon psychology. They acknowledged that Paarthurnax had indeed turned against Alduin and had provided crucial assistance to mortal heroes during the Dragon War. But they interpreted these actions not as evidence of genuine moral transformation, but rather as tactical decisions made by a being whose fundamental nature remained unchanged. The institutional knowledge of the Blades included detailed accounts of dragons who had, at various points in history, appeared to reform their behavior only to revert to their destructive patterns when circumstances changed or when their true interests were threatened. These cases had taught the Order that apparent dragon reformation was not evidence of genuine transformation, but rather a form of sophisticated deception, either conscious manipulation designed to achieve long-term goals or unconscious self-deception that temporarily masked but never eliminated the fundamental drives that defined draconic existence. Delphine's analysis of Paarthurnax's situation drew upon this historical understanding to reach conclusions that seemed harsh to those who had not studied dragon nature as extensively as the Blades had done. She acknowledged that Paarthurnax genuinely believed in his own transformation and that his intentions toward mortals appeared benevolent. But she maintained that these factors were irrelevant to the fundamental question of whether he could be trusted to remain benevolent under all possible future circumstances. The Blade's position was that dragon nature operated at levels deeper than conscious intention or philosophical commitment, that it was woven into the very fabric of draconic existence in ways that could not be altered through meditation, teaching, or any other form of spiritual discipline. A dragon might suppress or redirect these fundamental drives for extended periods, might even achieve genuine satisfaction from alternative forms of behavior, but the underlying nature would remain intact, waiting for the right circumstances to reassert itself with all its original power and destructiveness. This understanding led the Blades to conclude that the question of Paarthurnax's guilt or innocence regarding his past actions was less important than the question of what he might do in the future if his fundamental nature reasserted itself. From their perspective, the dragon's past service to mortal causes, while genuinely valuable, could not serve as a guarantee of future behavior, and his current benevolence, while apparently sincere, could not be counted upon to persist indefinitely in the face of circumstances that might trigger his deeper draconic drives. The institutional mission of the Blades was not merely to hunt and kill dragons, but to protect mortal civilization from threats that mortals themselves might not recognize or understand. This protective function required them to think not in terms of individual justice or personal redemption, but rather in terms of species survival and civilizational security. From this perspective, allowing any dragon to survive, regardless of its current behavior or stated intentions, represented an unacceptable risk to the future of humanity. Delphine's personal experience with dragons had reinforced rather than challenged these institutional beliefs. She had witnessed firsthand the devastation that dragons could inflict when their power was unleashed without restraint, and she had also observed the subtle ways in which even apparently reformed dragons could manipulate mortal emotions and perceptions to achieve their goals. Her training had taught her to look beyond surface appearances and immediate impressions to identify the deeper patterns of behavior that revealed true nature and genuine intention. The Blade's understanding of the relationship between dragons and mortals was fundamentally different from that of orders like the Greybeards, who saw potential for cooperation and mutual enrichment between the species. The Blades viewed this relationship as inherently competitive, with dragons and mortals representing different approaches to existence that could not coexist in the same world without one eventually dominating or destroying the other. History had shown that when dragons were permitted to exercise their power freely, mortal civilization suffered or was entirely destroyed, while periods of mortal flourishing coincided with periods when draconic influence was minimized or eliminated. This zero-sum understanding of dragon-mortal relations led the Blades to conclude that compromise positions were not merely ineffective, but actively dangerous, creating conditions that allowed dragons to rebuild their strength while appearing to cooperate with mortal interests. The Order's commitment to the complete elimination of dragonkind was not motivated by revenge or hatred, but rather by the conviction that no other approach could provide lasting security for mortal civilization. The tragedy of the Blade's position, from the perspective of those who admired Paarthurnax's apparent transformation, was that it seemed to leave no room for the possibility of genuine change or moral development in dragons. Yet the Blades would have argued that this apparent limitation was actually a strength, representing a realistic assessment of dragon nature that avoided the dangerous sentimentality that had led previous generations of mortals to trust dragons, who eventually betrayed that trust with catastrophic consequences. As the debate over Paarthurnax's fate intensified, the Blades found themselves in the position of defending truths that they believed were too important to be compromised by considerations of individual sympathy or philosophical speculation. Their institutional memory carried the weight of countless tragedies that had resulted from mortal willingness to trust in dragon reformation, and they were determined not to allow such tragedies to be repeated, regardless of how compelling the arguments for Paarthurnax's transformation might appear to those who lacked their comprehensive understanding of dragon nature. High upon the throat of the world, where the ancient monastery of High Hrothgar stood like a monument to the possibility of transcendence, the Greybeards had spent centuries developing an understanding of existence that challenged the harsh certainties embraced by orders like the Blades. Their wisdom was not born from the heat of battle or the urgency of survival, but rather from patient contemplation of the deepest mysteries of consciousness, will, and the potential for transformation that existed within all sentient beings, whether mortal or dragon. Arngeir, the only Greybeard who still spoke in the common tongue of mortals, served as the voice of an order whose understanding of Paarthurnax transcended simple categories of guilt and innocence, justice and mercy. When he spoke of their ancient teacher, his words carried the weight of centuries of direct experience with the dragon's guidance, generations of observation of Paarthurnax's behavior under every conceivable circumstance, and profound philosophical reflection on what it truly meant for any conscious being to achieve genuine transformation of their fundamental nature. The Greybeards' perspective on dragon nature differed fundamentally from that of the Blades, not because they were naive about the potential for draconic destructiveness, but because their understanding of consciousness itself operated according to different principles. Where the Blades saw fixed essences that could never truly change, the Greybeards perceived dynamic processes of development that could, through proper discipline and genuine commitment, transcend even the most fundamental limitations of original nature. This understanding emerged from their mastery of the way of the voice itself, which had taught them that the Thu'um was not merely a tool or technique, but rather a direct expression of the relationship between will and reality. Through decades of practice and meditation, the Greybeards had learned that conscious beings possessed the capacity to reshape not only their behavior and their circumstances, but even the deepest aspects of their own nature, provided they approached this work with sufficient wisdom, persistence, and humility. Their experience with Paarthurnax had demonstrated this principle in ways that no amount of theoretical speculation could have made possible. They had witnessed his struggles with his own draconic impulses, observed his victories and failures in the ongoing battle to express his fundamental nature in ways that served rather than dominated, and seen the gradual refinement of his understanding as he learned to find satisfaction in forms of power that enhanced rather than diminished other forms of life. Arngeir's defense of Paarthurnax was not based on sentimental attachment or wishful thinking, but rather on empirical observation of transformation that had been sustained across centuries of testing and challenge. The Greybeards had seen their teacher face situations that would have triggered the destructive impulses of an unreformed dragon, circumstances where the easy path would have been to revert to traditional patterns of dominance and control. Yet Paarthurnax had consistently chosen more difficult but more ethically sound approaches to these challenges. The philosophical framework that guided Greybeard, thinking about transformation, was based on their understanding of the way of the voice as a path of conscious evolution that was available to any being willing to undertake the necessary discipline. They recognized that such transformation was neither easy nor guaranteed, that it required constant vigilance and continuous commitment, but they also understood that genuine change was possible for any conscious being who approached the work with proper understanding and dedication. This perspective led them to view Paarthurnax not as a dragon who had somehow ceased to be draconic, but rather as a being who had discovered how to express his essential draconic nature in ways that aligned with higher principles of wisdom and compassion. His dominance had not disappeared, but had been refined and redirected, transformed from crude conquest into subtle guidance, from oppression into education, from destruction into cultivation of potential in others. The Greybeards understood that this transformation was not a destination that Paarthurnax had reached once and for all, but rather an ongoing process that required daily recommitment and constant refinement. They saw his struggles with his own nature not as evidence of failure or deception, but rather as honest acknowledgement of the magnitude of the work he had undertaken and the genuine difficulty of maintaining such transformation across the vast spans of draconic lifetime. Their observation of Paarthurnax's teaching methods had revealed to them the sophistication of his approach to guiding mortal development. Unlike a dragon who merely shared power with mortals for his own purposes, Paarthurnax had developed pedagogical techniques that honored the unique characteristics of mortal consciousness while still transmitting the essential insights that would allow humans to benefit from draconic wisdom. His teaching enhanced rather than dominated his students, creating conditions where they could develop their own understanding rather than simply becoming extensions of his will. The practical benefits that the Greybeards had derived from Paarthurnax's guidance extended far beyond the acquisition of Thuon techniques or philosophical insights. Through their relationship with him, they had developed forms of wisdom and spiritual discipline that would have been impossible to achieve through purely mortal means. Their understanding of the deeper mysteries of existence had been enriched by exposure to perspectives that could only come from a being whose consciousness operated according to the eternal principles that governed draconic thought. Yet the Greybeards also recognized that their relationship with Paarthurnax involved certain risks and challenges that required careful attention and ongoing vigilance. They understood that their teacher remained fundamentally a dragon, with all the power and potential for destructiveness that such nature implied. Their trust in him was not naive acceptance, but rather informed confidence based on centuries of observation and direct experience of his commitment to transformed existence. This nuanced understanding led the Greybeards to develop approaches to their relationship with Paarthurnax that honored both his genuine transformation and his continued draconic nature. They maintained appropriate respect for his power while engaging with him as a teacher and guide, creating forms of interaction that acknowledged the continuing challenges he faced while supporting his efforts to maintain his commitment to ethical behavior. The Greybeards' faith in the possibility of transformation extended beyond their specific experience with Paarthurnax to encompass a broader understanding of the potential for conscious evolution that existed within all sentient beings. Their philosophy taught that no being was permanently fixed in destructive patterns, that consciousness itself possessed an inherent tendency toward growth and refinement that could overcome even the most fundamental limitations of original nature, provided the necessary conditions for development were created and maintained. This understanding led them to view the debate over Paarthurnax's fate as a test of mortal wisdom and compassion, an opportunity for humans to demonstrate their own capacity for the kind of philosophical sophistication that true spiritual development required. From their perspective, the choice between vengeance and forgiveness, between punishment and support for continued transformation, revealed as much about the moral development of those making the choice as it did about the worthiness of its object. The Greybeards recognized that their position regarding Paarthurnax would be difficult for many mortals to accept, particularly those whose experience with dragons had been limited to contexts of conflict and destruction. Yet they maintained that true wisdom required the capacity to see beyond immediate appearances and emotional reactions to perceive the deeper realities that governed conscious existence, realities that included the genuine possibility of transformation even for beings whose original nature seemed to preclude such change. Their ultimate argument in favor of Paarthurnax was not that he had somehow ceased to be dangerous, or that his transformation was complete and irreversible, but rather that he represented proof of possibilities that were crucial for the future development of both mortal and draconic consciousness. His existence demonstrated that the relationship between species need not be governed by the crude dynamics of domination and submission, that forms of cooperation and mutual enrichment were possible that honored the essential nature of both while creating opportunities for growth that neither could achieve alone. As the debate over his fate intensified, the Greybeards found themselves in the position of defending not merely their teacher, but also their understanding of the fundamental nature of consciousness and the possibilities for transformation that existed within it. Their wisdom, accumulated over centuries of contemplation and practice, suggested that the choice regarding Paarthurnax would determine not only his future, but also the future relationship between dragons and mortals throughout Tamriel. In all the history of Tamriel, no being had ever occupied a position quite like that of the Dragonborn, the mortal hero whose very existence bridged the gap between human and dragon in ways that challenged every assumption about the nature of species, consciousness, and moral responsibility. Born with the soul of a dragon trapped within a mortal body, blessed and cursed with the ability to understand both perspectives from within, the Dragonborn faced a choice regarding Paarthurnax that transcended simple questions of justice or mercy to become a profound test of wisdom that would define not only the fate of one ancient dragon, but the future relationship between mortal and draconic consciousness throughout the world. The unique nature of the Dragonborn's consciousness created forms of understanding that were available to no other being in creation. Unlike mortals, who could only observe draconic behavior from the outside and speculate about its deeper motivations, the Dragonborn possessed direct access to the drives and impulses that governed dragon psychology. The Thuum came to them not as a learned technique, but as a natural expression of their fundamental nature, revealing through immediate experience what it meant to possess will so absolute that it could reshape reality through voice alone. This intimate understanding of draconic nature allowed the Dragonborn to perceive aspects of Paarthurnax's situation that remained hidden from purely mortal or purely draconic perspectives. They could feel within themselves the terrible hunger for dominance that defined dragon existence, the almost irresistible urge to express will through conquest and control that made every moment of restraint a victory over cosmic forces that demanded expression. Yet they also understood, through their mortal nature, the preciousness of the lives and freedoms that such dominance would destroy, the beauty inherent in finite existence that draconic eternality could never fully comprehend. The internal conflict that resulted from these dual perspectives created within the Dragonborn a form of philosophical tension that mirrored in many ways the struggles that Paarthurnax himself had faced during his own transformation. Like the ancient dragon, the Dragonborn was caught between two different ways of understanding existence, two different sets of values and priorities that seemed in many ways incompatible, yet both of which revealed important truths about the nature of consciousness and moral responsibility. The burden of decision regarding Paarthurnax's fate was made even heavier by the Dragonborn's awareness that their choice would be seen by all parties as definitive, carrying a weight and authority that derived not from political power or moral expertise, but from their unique position as the only being capable of truly understanding all aspects of the situation. The blades looked to them to fulfill the ancient mission of dragon slaying that had defined their order for millennia, while the greybeards trusted them to recognize the genuine transformation that their teacher had achieved and to honor the possibilities for continued growth that such transformation represented. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of the Dragonborn's dilemma was the recognition that their decision would, in a very real sense, be a judgment upon their own nature and potential. Paarthurnax represented proof that beings with draconic souls could transcend the crude expressions of dominance that characterized traditional dragon behavior, that consciousness possessed the capacity for transformation even at the deepest levels of fundamental nature. To execute Paarthurnax would be to deny this possibility, not only for him, but for all beings who carried within themselves the potential for both destruction and transcendence. The Dragonborn's experience of learning the Thu'um had revealed to them the seductive power of draconic abilities, the intoxicating sense of absolute control that came with the ability to bend reality to one's will through voice alone. They understood from within how easy it would be to lose oneself in the exercise of such power, to allow the hunger for dominance to overwhelm all other considerations and transform one into the kind of destructive force that the blades feared all dragons inevitably became. This personal knowledge of temptation made the Dragonborn's evaluation of Paarthurnax's achievement all the more remarkable. They could appreciate, in ways that purely mortal observers could not, the magnitude of self-discipline required to maintain restraint in the face of power that could reshape mountains and silence storms. Every moment of Paarthurnax's peaceful existence represented a victory over impulses that the Dragonborn felt within their own soul, a demonstration of possibilities for conscious evolution that offered hope for their own future development. The philosophical complexity of the situation was further complicated by the Dragonborn's understanding that their own existence represented a form of experiment in consciousness, a test of whether draconic and mortal perspectives could be integrated into something greater than either could achieve alone. Their relationship with Paarthurnax was not simply that of hero to teacher or judge to defendant, but rather that of kindred spirit to kindred spirit. Two beings who shared the challenge of finding ways to honor their draconic nature while serving purposes that transcended self-gratification. The practical considerations that surrounded the decision were equally complex and demanding. The Dragonborn understood that their choice would have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate question of Paarthurnax's survival, that it would establish precedents and send messages that would influence the relationship between dragons and mortals for generations to come. A decision to spare Paarthurnax would signal that transformation was possible and could be recognized and honored, while a decision to execute him would demonstrate that past actions created obligations that no amount of subsequent development could erase. The weight of these implications was intensified by the Dragonborn's awareness that other dragons were beginning to return to the world, awakened by Alduin's presence and the renewed prominence of the Thu'um in mortal affairs. The precedent established by their treatment of Paarthurnax would influence how these other dragons approached the question of their own relationship with mortals, determining whether they saw cooperation and transformation as viable options or whether they concluded that eternal conflict was the only possibility. The Dragonborn's unique perspective also allowed them to recognize aspects of the debate that purely mortal participants might miss. They understood that the question of Paarthurnax's guilt or innocence regarding his past actions was less important than the question of what his continued existence might make possible for the future development of draconic consciousness. His transformation represented a breakthrough in understanding that could potentially benefit not only other dragons, but also future Dragonborn who would face similar challenges in integrating their dual nature. The spiritual dimension of the decision was equally profound, touching upon questions about the nature of redemption, the possibility of genuine transformation, and the responsibilities that conscious beings bore toward each other, regardless of species or past actions. The Dragonborn's choice would reflect their understanding of whether consciousness possessed the capacity for fundamental change, or whether beings were permanently fixed in patterns established by their original nature. As the moment of decision approached, the Dragonborn found themselves standing at a crossroads that symbolized not only the immediate question of Paarthurnax's fate, but also the broader questions about what kinds of relationships were possible between different forms of consciousness. Their choice would determine whether the future would be governed by the harsh certainties that demanded justice for past crimes, or by the more complex wisdom that recognized the potential for transformation and growth even in the most unlikely circumstances. The burden of this decision was made heavier by the Dragonborn's understanding that there was no purely objective standpoint from which to evaluate the situation, no external authority that could provide definitive guidance about the right course of action. They stood alone with their dual nature and unique perspective, called upon to make a choice that would define not only Paarthurnax's future, but also their own understanding of what it meant to possess both mortal wisdom and draconic power in a world where the relationship between these forces remained to be determined. In the end, the Dragonborn's dilemma represented the ultimate test of whether consciousness possessed the wisdom and courage necessary to transcend the limitations of its original programming and create new possibilities for existence that honored both the demands of justice and the potential for transformation that existed within all sentient beings. As the great debate swirled around the question of Paarthurnax's fate, with the Blades demanding justice for ancient crimes and the Greybeards pleading for recognition of genuine transformation, a deeper truth began to emerge that challenged the very foundations upon which all parties had built their arguments. This truth was not hidden in ancient texts or locked away in secret archives, but rather lay in plain sight, obscured only by mortal assumptions about what deception meant and what transparency required from beings whose existence operated according to principles that transcended conventional understanding. The revelation came not through dramatic discovery or scholarly breakthrough, but through the gradual recognition that Paarthurnax had never actually deceived anyone about his fundamental nature or his ongoing struggles with the drives that defined draconic existence. From the very beginning of his transformation, from his first interactions with mortal heroes to his centuries of teaching at High Hrothgar, he had been completely transparent about what he was, what he had done, and what he continued to battle within himself every day of his immortal existence. When mortals spoke with Paarthurnax, he did not present himself as a reformed being who had abandoned his draconic nature and adopted mortal values. Instead, he spoke openly about the constant struggle required to express his fundamental drives in ways that served rather than destroyed, about the ongoing effort needed to find satisfaction in teaching and guidance rather than conquest and domination. He acknowledged his past role in the oppression of mankind, not with excuses or justifications, but with the simple honesty of one who understood the weight of his actions and accepted responsibility for their consequences. The ancient dragon had never claimed that his transformation was complete or irreversible, never suggested that he had somehow transcended the fundamental impulses that defined dragon psychology. Instead, he spoke of his changed behavior as an ongoing discipline, a daily choice to redirect his nature toward purposes that aligned with wisdom rather than mere power. He described his relationship with his own draconic drives not as victory over them, but as an eternal vigilance that would be required for as long as he drew breath. This transparency extended to his discussions of the philosophical framework that guided his transformed existence. Paarthurnax openly acknowledged that his commitment to the way of the voice was not based on the adoption of mortal ethical systems, but rather on his recognition that the highest expression of draconic dominance lay not in crushing opposition, but in creating conditions where all forms of consciousness could flourish according to their essential nature. His teaching was itself a form of dominance, but dominance refined and elevated to serve purposes greater than immediate self-gratification. The deception that had shaped the great debate was not anything that Paarthurnax had said or failed to reveal, but rather the assumptions that mortals brought to their understanding of what redemption meant and what transformation required. Most humans, influenced by their own experience of moral development, assumed that genuine change meant abandoning one's previous nature and adopting entirely new patterns of behavior and motivation. They expected redemption to involve a fundamental alteration of personality that would make past actions irrelevant to present character. Yet, Paarthurnax's transformation operated according to different principles entirely, principles that honored rather than abandoned his essential draconic nature, while finding new ways to express that nature in service of purposes that transcended individual desire. He remained fundamentally a dragon, with all the power and potential for dominance that such nature implied, but he had learned to channel these forces in ways that enhanced rather than diminished the potential of other forms of life. The beautiful complexity of this truth lay in its recognition that genuine transformation did not require the abandonment of one's fundamental essence, but rather its conscious refinement and ethical application. Paarthurnax had not ceased to be draconic, but had instead discovered what it might mean to be draconic in the highest and most sophisticated sense possible. His dominance had become subtle rather than crude, educational rather than oppressive, liberating rather than enslaving. This understanding revealed that the question of whether Paarthurnax could be trusted was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what trust meant in the context of relationships with beings whose nature operated according to eternal rather than temporal principles. The issue was not whether he might revert to destructive behavior if circumstances changed, but rather whether mortals possessed the wisdom to engage with a being whose transformation was real, but whose fundamental nature remained essentially unchanged. The ancient dragon's honesty about his ongoing struggles with draconic impulses was not evidence of deception or incomplete transformation, but rather proof of the genuine nature of his philosophical development. A being who truly understood the magnitude of his own power and the constant effort required to express that power ethically would necessarily acknowledge the ongoing challenges such discipline presented. To claim complete victory over draconic drives would have been the real deception, a false reassurance that ignored the eternal nature of the vigilance required. Paarthurnax's transparency extended to his acknowledgement that other dragons might not be capable of achieving the same kind of transformation that he had accomplished, and that even his own success was dependent upon circumstances and choices that could not be guaranteed to remain stable indefinitely. He never claimed that his example proved all dragons could be redeemed or that draconic nature could be easily transformed through simple application of will or desire. Instead, he presented his own journey as evidence of possibilities rather than proof of universal principles. The recognition of this deeper truth transformed the entire framework within which the debate about Paarthurnax's fate had been conducted. The question was no longer whether he had genuinely changed or whether he might revert to destructive behavior, but rather whether mortals possessed the philosophical sophistication necessary to engage with a being whose transformation was real but whose fundamental nature remained complex and potentially dangerous. This shift in understanding revealed that the choice facing the Dragonborn was not simply a decision about justice or mercy, but rather a test of mortal wisdom and courage. Could humanity develop the kind of nuanced understanding necessary to recognize genuine transformation that did not conform to their conventional expectations? Could they appreciate the beauty of a being who had learned to express eternal drives in ways that served temporal purposes without abandoning the essential characteristics that made such expression possible? The deeper truth about Paarthurnax was that he represented a form of conscious evolution that transcended the simple categories of good and evil, reformed and unreformed, trustworthy and dangerous. He embodied the possibility that consciousness could develop in ways that honored its fundamental nature while finding increasingly sophisticated expressions for that nature that aligned with principles of wisdom and compassion. This understanding suggested that the real deception lay not in anything Paarthurnax had said or failed to reveal, but in mortal expectations about what transformation meant and what relationships with transformed beings required. The beautiful lie was the comfortable belief that redemption meant abandoning one's essential nature and adopting entirely new patterns of behavior, when the deeper truth suggested that genuine transformation involved the conscious refinement of eternal characteristics in service of purposes that transcended immediate self-interest. The revelation of this truth did not make the choice regarding Paarthurnax's fate any easier, but it did clarify what was really at stake in that choice. The decision would determine not only whether one ancient dragon would continue to exist, but also whether mortals possessed the wisdom necessary to engage with forms of consciousness that operated according to principles more complex than their conventional moral categories could easily accommodate. As this deeper understanding began to influence the great debate, it became clear that the question of Paarthurnax's deception had been answered not through the discovery of hidden facts or the resolution of contradictory evidence, but through the recognition that the most profound truths about consciousness and transformation often lay hidden in plain sight, obscured only by assumptions that prevented observers from perceiving realities that challenged their conventional understanding of what was possible in the relationship between different forms of sentient existence. The scholar Theron sat in his tower study as the first light of dawn painted the distant peaks of Skyrim in hues of gold and rose, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of ages and the weight of understanding that had grown within his mind like a gentle river, gradually carving new channels through ancient stone. The months of research and contemplation had led him to insights that transformed not only his understanding of Paarthurnax, but his entire conception of what it meant for conscious beings to grapple with questions that transcended the simple moral categories that governed most human thinking. The resolution that had emerged from his philosophical journey was not the kind of dramatic revelation that provided clear answers to previously troubling questions, but rather a deeper appreciation for the beautiful complexity that characterized existence at its most profound levels. He had come to understand that the debate over Paarthurnax's fate was not really about one ancient dragon's worthiness or unworthiness of continued existence, but rather about humanity's capacity to develop forms of wisdom sophisticated enough to engage with realities that challenged conventional assumptions about justice, redemption, and the possibilities for conscious evolution. The truth about Paarthurnax, Theron realized, lay not in resolving the apparent contradictions in his nature, but in learning to appreciate those contradictions as expressions of a reality more complex and beautiful than human moral philosophy typically acknowledged. The ancient dragon was simultaneously guilty of terrible crimes against humanity and genuinely transformed in his current expression of draconic nature, both potentially dangerous due to his unchanging essential characteristics and trustworthy due to his demonstrated commitment to ethical behavior sustained across centuries of testing. This paradoxical nature was not a problem to be solved, but rather a reality to be appreciated, a demonstration that consciousness itself operated according to principles that transcended the binary categories of good and evil, reformed and unreformed, safe and dangerous, that humans typically use to organize their understanding of moral questions. Paarthurnax embodied the possibility that beings could be simultaneously multiple things, that transformation could be both real and limited, that trust could coexist with vigilance in relationships that honored the complexity of all participants. The philosophical framework that emerged from this understanding suggested that the highest forms of wisdom involved not the resolution of paradox, but the development of consciousness, sophisticated enough to hold contradictory truths in creative tension. The scholar had learned that attempting to force complex realities into simple categories often obscured rather than revealed the deeper truths that could guide ethical decision-making in situations where conventional moral reasoning proved inadequate. This insight transformed the Ron's understanding of what the various parties in the debate had been attempting to accomplish. The Blades, with their insistence on the impossibility of genuine dragon reformation, were not simply being rigid or unforgiving, but rather protecting important truths about the dangers inherent in draconic nature and the historical consequences of mortal naivety regarding dragon behavior. Their perspective served as a necessary counterweight to romantic idealization that ignored real risks in favor of wishful thinking. Similarly, the Greybeard's defense of Paarthurnax was not mere sentimentality or attachment to their teacher, but rather reflected their deep understanding of consciousness as a dynamic process capable of development and refinement that could transcend even the most fundamental limitations of original nature. Their faith in transformation was based on centuries of direct observation and philosophical reflection that revealed possibilities invisible to those who had not undertaken similar depths of contemplation and practice. The Dragonborn's unique position in this debate represented not simply the burden of making a difficult choice, but rather the opportunity to demonstrate a form of wisdom that could integrate the valid insights of all perspectives while transcending the limitations that prevented any single viewpoint from encompassing the full complexity of the situation. Their decision would reflect not only their judgment about Paarthurnax, but also their understanding of what kinds of relationships were possible between different forms of consciousness. Theron's philosophical resolution suggested that the choice regarding Paarthurnax's fate was ultimately less important than the quality of understanding that informed that choice. A decision made from appreciation of complexity and acknowledgement of paradox would represent wisdom regardless of its specific content, while a choice based on the oversimplification of inherently complex realities would reflect a failure of philosophical development, even if it achieved practically beneficial results. The deeper implications of this understanding extended far beyond the immediate question of one dragon's survival to encompass fundamental questions about how conscious beings should relate to each other across differences of nature, history, and potential. The debate over Paarthurnax had become a test case for humanity's capacity to develop forms of wisdom sophisticated enough to engage with the genuine complexity that characterized existence at its most profound levels. This recognition led Theron to understand that the true resolution of the Paarthurnax question lay not in any particular decision about his fate, but rather in the development of consciousness capable of appreciating the beautiful complexity that his existence represented. The ancient dragon served as a mirror in which mortals could examine their own capacity for philosophical sophistication, their willingness to engage with realities that challenged their conventional assumptions, and their courage to acknowledge truths that could not be easily categorized or simply understood. The philosophical journey that had begun with questions about deception and truth had evolved into an exploration of consciousness itself and the possibilities for growth and development that existed within all sentient beings. Paarthurnax had become not merely the subject of inquiry, but also the teacher whose very existence demonstrated forms of wisdom that transcended the simple moral categories that typically governed human thinking about right and wrong. As Theron contemplated the insights that his months of study had produced, he understood that the real gift of the Paarthurnax question was not any particular answer it might generate, but rather the quality of thinking it required from those who engaged with it seriously. The ancient dragon had challenged humanity to develop forms of wisdom worthy of the complexity he embodied, forms of understanding that could appreciate transformation without ignoring danger, that could recognize genuine change without abandoning appropriate caution. The resolution that emerged from this philosophical journey was thus not a conclusion, but rather a beginning, an invitation to develop forms of consciousness sophisticated enough to engage with the beautiful complexity that characterized existence when approached with sufficient depth and nuance. The debate over Paarthurnax had revealed possibilities for wisdom that extended far beyond any single moral question to encompass the fundamental challenge of what it meant to be conscious beings capable of growth, understanding, and ethical relationship with forms of life that operated according to principles different from their own. In the gentle light of dawn, surrounded by books that whispered ancient secrets and insights that had accumulated like layers of understanding in his mind, Theron realized that his quest to discover the truth about Paarthurnax had become a journey toward appreciation of truth itself as something more complex, more beautiful, and more worthy of reverence than he had ever imagined possible. Section 15: Eternal Peace and Understanding. As the morning sun climbed higher into the sky above Skyrim, casting long shadows across the ancient landscape where dragons had once ruled and mortals had learned to dream of freedom, the scholar Theron closed the final volume of his research and sat in the profound silence that follows the completion of a journey toward understanding. The quest that had begun with questions about deception and truth had evolved into something far more precious, a deep appreciation for the beautiful complexity that characterized existence when approached with wisdom, patience, and the courage to embrace realities that transcended simple moral categories. The truth about Paarthurnax, he now understood, was not a secret to be uncovered or a mystery to be solved, but rather a profound teaching about the nature of consciousness itself and the possibilities for transformation that existed within all sentient beings. The ancient dragon had never deceived anyone about his nature or his struggles, had never claimed to be anything other than what he was, a being of immense power who had learned to express that power in service of purposes greater than immediate self-gratification, yet who remained fundamentally draconic in all the essential aspects of his existence. The deception that had shaped the great debate was not Paarthurnax's, but rather humanity's comfortable assumption that redemption required the abandonment of one's essential nature. That transformation meant becoming something entirely different rather than discovering more sophisticated ways to express eternal characteristics. The beautiful lie was the belief that moral questions could be resolved through simple application of conventional categories, when the deeper truth suggested that the highest forms of wisdom required the capacity to appreciate paradox and embrace complexity. Through his long study, Theron had come to understand that Paarthurnax represented not a problem to be solved but a gift to be received. A living demonstration of possibilities that extended far beyond any single individual to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and the potential for growth that existed within all forms of sentient life. The ancient dragon served as proof that beings could honor their essential nature while finding increasingly refined ways to express that nature in alignment with principles of wisdom and compassion. This understanding transformed the entire framework within which questions of justice and mercy, guilt and redemption, safety and danger could be considered. The scholar realized that the choice regarding Paarthurnax's fate was ultimately less important than the quality of consciousness that informed that choice, the depth of understanding that recognized the beautiful complexity he embodied, and the wisdom that could appreciate transformation without ignoring the ongoing vigilance such transformation required. The mountain peak where Paarthurnax had spent centuries in contemplation and teaching stood as a monument to the possibility that conscious beings could transcend the limitations of their original programming while still honoring the fundamental characteristics that made such transcendence meaningful. His existence demonstrated that dominance could be refined into guidance, that power could be expressed through restraint, that the eternal drives that defined draconic nature could find satisfaction in forms of expression that enhanced rather than diminished other forms of life. As Theron contemplated the insights that his philosophical journey had produced, he understood that the real gift of the Paarthurnax question was not any particular answer it might generate, but rather the quality of thinking it demanded from those who engaged with it seriously. The ancient dragon had challenged humanity to develop forms of wisdom worthy of the complexity he represented, forms of understanding that could hold contradictory truths in creative tension without losing appreciation for the deeper realities that unified apparent opposites. The peace that settled into the scholar's mind was not the satisfaction of having solved a difficult problem, but rather the deeper contentment that came from learning to appreciate mystery and complexity as expressions of truth rather than obstacles to understanding. He had discovered that the most profound insights often emerged not from resolving paradox, but from developing consciousness sophisticated enough to recognize the beauty inherent in realities that transcended simple categorization. The ancient texts that surrounded him in his study seemed to whisper their approval of this understanding, as if the accumulated wisdom of ages recognized in his journey, a reflection of the eternal quest for truth that had motivated scholars and seekers throughout history. The knowledge that had been preserved in these volumes pointed toward the same recognition that his study of Paarthurnax had produced, that consciousness itself was a mystery worthy of reverence, capable of development and refinement that could transcend even the most fundamental limitations of original nature. High upon the throat of the world, the ancient dragon continued his patient meditation, his existence serving as a bridge between species and a testament to possibilities that few had imagined and fewer still had achieved. His transformation was neither complete nor guaranteed to remain stable indefinitely. Yet it represented proof that conscious beings possessed the capacity for growth that could reshape their relationship with existence itself, while still honoring the essential characteristics that made such growth meaningful. The eternal vigilance that Paarthurnax maintained was not a burden but a gift, a daily choice to redirect power toward purposes that served the greater good, a conscious expression of dominance refined to its highest and most sophisticated form. His teaching of the way of the voice had created a tradition that would outlast any individual practitioner, a living legacy that demonstrated the possibility of transforming crude expressions of will into subtle instruments of wisdom and guidance. As the day advanced and shadows shifted across the ancient landscape of Skyrim, Theron understood that his quest for truth had led him not to definitive answers, but to deeper questions, not to simple resolutions, but to appreciation for complexity that would continue to enrich his understanding for whatever years remained to him. The scholar had learned that wisdom lay not in conquering mystery, but in learning to dance with it, not in forcing reality into predetermined categories, but in developing consciousness capable of appreciating truth in all its beautiful and contradictory manifestations. The story of Paarthurnax would continue to unfold across the centuries, each generation discovering new aspects of the questions his existence raised, new insights into the nature of consciousness, and the possibilities for transformation that characterized existence at its most profound levels. His legacy was not any particular teaching or technique, but rather the living proof that conscious beings possessed capabilities for growth and development that transcended their wildest imaginings. In the gentle peace of his study, surrounded by the wisdom of ages and enriched by understanding that had grown like light, gradually filling a darkened room, Theron realized that the ancient dragon had given him the greatest gift that any teacher could bestow. Not answers that would satisfy curiosity, but questions that would continue to inspire wonder, not solutions that would end inquiry, but mysteries that would fuel the eternal human quest for truth, beauty, and understanding that made consciousness itself the most precious and remarkable phenomenon in all of creation. The truth about Paarthurnax rested peacefully in the scholar's mind, not as a conclusion but as a beginning, not as an ending, but as an invitation to continue the journey toward wisdom that would last as long as conscious beings continued to seek understanding of themselves and their place in the vast, beautiful, endlessly complex mystery of existence itself.